The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 140.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Welcome back to the EL. Today we have Brigid Schulte, author of Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When No One Else Has the Time. Welcome, Brigid, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Thank you so much for having me.
Will you take just a moment before we take a deep dive into the book and take some time to introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about you personally?
Sure. Right now I am a reporter, or I've been a longtime reporter for the Washington Post. Been a journalist for most of my adult life. I've covered national politics, and I've covered the Pentagon and defense, and public health and education. I've just covered a wide variety of things through my career. I'm married. I'm the mom of two kids. They are now 13 and 16, and in that stage where they don't need me quite as much physically and think I'm kind of a dork. So I'm trying to figure out, navigate new course of parenthood. Both my husband and I are. I live in Alexandria, Virginia, grew up in Portland, Oregon, and that's probably as much as you need to hear right now, right?
That's perfect. Thank you for sharing that. And now we can jump right into your book, Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time, which was actually not made available that long ago. Actually, you said the hardcover in March of 2014, and then the paperback with some revisions roughly in the next couple months, March 2015. Is that accurate?
That's right. The paperback will be coming out. The hardback came out March 2014, and the paperback will be coming out March 2015.
Okay, excellent. So Brigid, we're going to move quickly, but here are the top questions that our listener/future reader would like to get answered. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing Overwhelmed?
I have to say, it was a completely accidental book. Through my career, I have always wanted to write a book. There are lots of journalists out there that's sort of a big dream that they have, and you just get so busy and so crazed in the kind of day-to-day that you don't really have time to think about it. And that's certainly how I was. Layered on top of that I was trying to be a mom and raise two kids and try to be an extraordinary mom and an extraordinary journalist and try to do it all, not just have it all, but do it all, right? I was part of this group at the Washington Post. This all started really, talk about one event that changes your life, because this book really has changed my life. I was part of this group in the Washington Post where we were looking at our readership numbers. And this is a couple years ago, and we were noticing a big gap, really for the first time, between male and female readers, that more men were reading the newspaper than women were. And this is before we'd made the switch to digital. So this was all the print, kind of the print newspaper in the morning. And the reason why that's important is that women over 50 have always been the most loyal newspaper readers. So if you look, and if women are not developing the habit of reading the newspaper early on, then a couple decades later, you don't have people buying your product. That's a real huge problem. And so the powers that be put together what they called the Women Readers Committee, and they wanted to understand, why are women not reading the paper, and how do we bring them back? How do we attract them to the paper? And I was appointed to this committee, and it was all women on this committee, which I thought was very weird. And the first thing we did is looked around at each other and rolled our eyes, because it was like, are you kidding? Mornings at my house, do you know what that's like? It was like, duh, women aren't reading the paper. We're not reading the paper in the morning, and we work for the paper. And it became sort of this confessional about just how crazy our lives were. My husband would be able to read the newspaper in the morning with his little half glasses standing at the counter, and I was crazy, emptying the dishwasher and loading the dishwasher and making lunches and making sure the homework got done. And what's this crumpled up in the garbage can? And oh my God, it's picture day, and you've got a stain on your shirt, and come back here. And it was just crazy. And so I would often read the paper later. Some people would read the style section at 10 o'clock at night. And so we said, well, women aren't reading the paper because they're busy. And so being reporters and investigative journalists, we wanted to get data to show that. And that's what I volunteered for. I said, well, I'll find the data. So not knowing anything, I Googled busy mother, women, time, and came across this guy named John Robinson, who is a time use researcher. I'd never even heard of that field. I didn't know that there was such a thing. It's a fairly young social science, really been only around for a couple decades in the United States. But I called him up and I said, we're doing this report on why women aren't reading the newspaper, and we figure they're too busy. And he interrupted me and he said, wrong. Women aren't busy. Women have 30 hours of leisure a week. They have more time now to enjoy themselves and just relax than they did in the 1960s, even though more of them are in the marketplace. And they don't have quite as much time as men, but men have 40 hours of leisure a week. Well, at that, I just about fell out of my chair. I said, I was speechless. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have 30 hours of leisure a week. And he said, yes, you do. Come and do a time study with me and I will show you where your leisure is. And honestly, Wade, that's what started this entire book, is that he laid down the challenge that I had all this leisure time that I didn't feel that I did. And so I did do that time study, and I wrote a magazine piece for the Washington Post magazine. And that's what started this whole journey.
That's an awesome story. Thank you for sharing that. Bridget, there's so many books we talked about that come out every single month. And so I want to give you an opportunity to differentiate yours from others. So what makes your book different from others regarding the same or similar topic?
Well, I guess what I'd like to say is that there are all sorts of great books out there and they take deep dives or at different aspects of, work and how to work more productively and how to be more efficient. There are books that look at, frankly, most of the books that deal with the life side of the equation are sort of like the mommy books. Oh, I'm so overwhelmed. And how do I do it all? Which, I've read and they're funny, but they don't kind of get you anywhere. And really, nobody looks at, I guess, I would say what really differentiates my book, because it's hard to categorize. It's been called a business book. It's been called a work-life book. It's been called a, book of philosophy or reporting or reportage. It really looks at the big picture and how interconnected everything is. And I took my inspiration from Harvard psychologist Erik Erikson. And he said, the richest and fullest lives make time for the three great arenas of life: work, love, and play. And I think that's what the strength of my book is, that I look at the three great arenas of life that make up the good life, that really what we're all striving for in our very short time here on earth. How do you lead a good life with meaningful work, with close connection, with love? Because there are plenty of studies that show that is the basis of human happiness, our connection with others. And time to play, and what the Greeks said, refreshed our soul, to find that place where we are most fully human. So there are plenty of books that do kind of one thing or the other. I would argue that mine looks at the bigger picture. And I think the most important thing is I ask two questions. Why are things the way they are? Because I didn't want to say the what. I think we all know we feel busy, we feel stressed, we're overwhelmed. There's lots of good data that supports that that's a very universal feeling for a lot of different reasons. So I didn't want to do the what. I wanted to do not only the why. Why are things the way they are? But more importantly, I wanted to know the second question: how can they be better? And as a reporter and as a journalist and as a writer, I wanted to take all my skills as a reporter and look for real world bright spots, if you will, real examples of where things are shifting, where things are changing, where people are doing things or thinking differently. Now, look, I love all of the magazines that are out there that say, 10 ways to take back your time, 7 hacks to do this, 9 ways to do that. But the thing is, if it were that easy, we would all be doing it. So I wanted to understand how difficult it is, but then again, look for role models for real world changes that are actually happening, because we learn by story, we learn by narrative. We begin to feel more courageous about making changes when we see what others have done. So I wanted to do both. Reading the book is an experience of it's like a roller coaster. If I've done my job, you'll read the why are things the way they are and maybe get mad and depressed and sort of angry, which is what I did. I sort of opened my eyes. It's like, what? Why is it like this? And then the next section, you'll see, oh, wow, they're doing it differently. Maybe I could do that. And you'll get hopeful. So it'll be like a roller coaster ride. And then the next section, I do it for both, for work, love, and play, kind of answer those two questions. Why are things the way they are and how can they be better?
So how do you suggest the reader engage with your book? Is this one they can jump in and out of grabbing information, or should they really, or did you design it to be read from front to back?
Really, that is a great question, and it is one that I get all the time, sort of tongue in cheek. Why did you write a book for busy people? Why did you think that they would ever have time to read it? And I wrote the book because I needed the book. I wrote the book I needed to read that I didn't see out there. And I wrote it because it opened my eyes, and I want to be able to help other people open theirs and begin to see what kind of shifts they can make. I really end up calling for change on two levels: the big structural change that may take a while. And so, what can I do right here and right now to move toward living a good life or feel better about it? And so I wrote the book very intentionally that you can read it any number of ways, because I understand people are busy. They don't feel like they have a lot of time. They feel very pressed. So you can read it the traditional way as a journey. It is a journey. You can read it from start to finish. You can go to the table of contents, and you can just see, are there certain sections that you feel that you want to read about? Is there a chapter that calls to you? Each chapter is really a standalone. You can read just the chapter. And in several sections, I have what I call, they're very short, maybe 1 or 2 pages. I call them chapterlets. They're so small that's a bright spot. That's just, you can read just that 2 to 3 pages to get inspiration, like, wow, somebody's doing it differently. And an example of that is I profile Michelle Flournoy, who was one of the top civilian leaders at the Pentagon under the first Obama administration. And she is an incredibly hard worker. She's often listed, spoken of as a potential future Secretary of Defense. So she's no slouch in the work world, but she's also the mom of 3 kids, and that's very important to her. And so when she went in to interview for the job, Secretary Gates at the time said, what do you need? And she said, I need to be home more often than not for dinner time and touchstone time with my kids. And he's like, sure. And he set her all secure systems up in her home so she could work in her home office if she needed to in the evenings. She hired a driver so she could get work done to and from work. She made sure that she scheduled in when she needed to work in the concession stand at her son's varsity football game. And she thought to herself, I feel so supported in being authentic, my full self at work and at home and at play. What can I do then to turn around and support my own employees? And she re-engineered 2 of the busiest shops in the Pentagon during 2 wars and made a way to create an alternative work schedule, completely rewire the culture where it was performance that they valued and not long hours, so that people could begin to feel that they had time for their lives and rewire their own lives. So that is a really powerful and positive bright spot, and you can read just that story. And the last thing you can do, if you really don't have any time, I've taken sort of everything that I learned in the book and I put it all in the back in an appendix called Do One Thing. And there you can read it and you can find one thing that you can just try.
Excellent. Well, very good. Well, Bridget, at this point, I feel like we've already started to uncover a little bit of the book, but now that we know the background and the purpose, let's take a little bit deeper of a dive and almost like you're sitting at coffee with one of your friends and ask you, what am I going to get out of your book? So you take the next couple minutes and really lay out what we can expect.
Sure. So the book is divided into 5 sections. And the first one is I call it time confetti, because that's what when I started this journey, that's what my time felt like, just doing everything all at once, all in little teeny tiny scraps of time that kind of were like exploding all over the place. I felt out of control, chaotic. I could never finish my to-do list. I was always getting distracted. Nothing. I just felt inadequate at work, inadequate at home, that I never had time to do much of anything. And so I really explore that. The first chapter, you have to read beyond the first chapter. That's the hardest part. I still have a hard time reading that because that really lays out how it felt like to live in time confetti. And then I went to Paris to a time use research conference, and that's where I put that in a global context, in a historical context. And I really look at the question of leisure. What is leisure time? Who has ever had it? And I look at the history of leisure and how it's different for men and women, and also people of different economic means. And then I really explore the question of busyness. We tend to think of being busy as the way we show our value. It's a status symbol. And I found a researcher in, of all places, Fargo, North Dakota, and that's all she does is study busyness and the fast pace of life. And it blew my mind because I called her up and I said, I live in Washington. I thought everybody was type A crazy here. And she just said, oh, honey, you want to meet some overwhelmed North Dakotans? I can arrange that. And so that part of the book is set in North Dakota at a focus group she set up, and she studies Christmas letters or holiday letters that people have been sending since the 1960s, and it's all about how we show our reality in the words we use. And you can really, I spent the afternoon going through her archive with her, and it is exhausting when you read people's holiday letters, and you can see a real change in what we value over the last couple decades. So that goes into, that's a bit more philosophy as well, because it talks about to live a full true life, you have to kind of be aware that it's finite. It's not going to last forever. And sometimes we cover ourselves in busyness because that's kind of scary to think about. And it's a way to avoid thinking of those scarier but bigger questions like, what do I want my life to mean? And what's important to me? And how do I make time for that? The next section looks at the last part of that chapter is really looking at the consequences of all of this being overwhelmed. And I went to the Yale Stress Center and looked at some really fascinating research that they're doing about how stress is affecting our brain. It's actually shrinking our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the thinking part of the brain that we need to learn and remember and make decisions. So if you didn't think it was important that you're feeling overwhelmed, that's sort of the chapter you need to read about why it is important. And then the next part of the book, it's divided into work. The next section is love. The next section is play. And the last section is called Toward Time Serenity. And that I would call the personal mastery section, where it really looks at, okay, we do live in a world where overwork, overdoing, overparenting is valued. In the United States in particular, our laws, our policies, our cultural attitudes are really out of step with the way we're living. And so while that larger change is definitely something we need to be working toward, that would not only help people live better lives, but would also make business better and be more focus on more innovation and performance rather than long hours and kind of being a FaceTime warrior is what I call them. So this Toward Time Serenity looks at that may not be something that you can personally change. You can work toward that and support it, but what can I do in my own life to make some shifts? And that's what that personal mastery chapter is about. That section, and in the work section, I talk about policy. I have a section about the ideal worker norm and where that came from and why that's so powerful and why that's holding all of us back. And then I have a section that I really like called When Work Works. And that is, there are sort of profiles of different really innovative companies and industries that are doing things differently and finding time for people to do good work and have time for their love, the family, the neighborhood, the community, and time to play and have leisure. In the love section, I talk a lot about our gender roles and what many sociologists call the stalled gender revolution, why women are still doing about twice the housework and 3 times the childcare, even though men are doing more. Why there's still that kind of imbalance in the division of labor. And then I talk very frankly about my own marriage, which after 20 years, we had started out wanting to be equal partners, and after 20 years had gotten really out of balance. And I finally put a huge list together. Who takes the kids to the doctor? Me. Dentist? Me. Who does the bills? Me. Laundry? Me. Shopping? Me. It's like, wow, how did it get so bad? And then we really worked very hard at trying to kind of reset. And we've done a really good job. But it starts off with a very, very bad Thanksgiving tale where I was doing everything and my husband was drinking beer. So then I also talk about the cult of intensive motherhood, why parenting standards, particularly for mothers, have really ratcheted up. And so what we're expected to do at work is higher than it ever has been before. The hours we're expected to put in are higher for everybody. But also the parenting on the life side, what we're expecting to parents to do to be considered a quote unquote good parent is also higher than it's ever been. And I really explore that. And what I say, it's really fueled by guilt, fear, and ambivalence. And then the bright spot is I look at the changing role of men and fathers. And I spent some time with younger men and younger fathers and some really fascinating emerging research about how important it is for these younger fathers to not just be the paycheck, not just be the fun dad on the weekends, but truly a partner and truly involved. And how that's really changing the equation and how important that is. That all the time that we've talked about having it all, we tend to think that's a question for women, but it's also a question for men. Can men have it all? Because they certainly are showing they want to. And then the bright spot there is looking at kids. What do kids need? And, all of this over-parenting, helicopter parenting, overscheduling, is it really good for them? And it's really not. And what kids really need are the same things that we need, which is unstructured time to figure out who they are, what they like, what's important to them, to try something and fail and learn how to pick themselves up and try something else, to develop grit and perseverance. That's really what matters, not just for kids, but throughout our lives. And then the play section, I went to Denmark. There's a chapter set in Denmark. And the reason for that is when I was at the Paris Time Use Conference, it was fascinating. They put up a big chart about men and women's leisure around the world. And the only country that was kind of interesting and different was Denmark, because women had almost as much leisure time as men, whereas in other countries, there's a huge gap. Men have more leisure time than women. But the other thing that was really that kind of blew my mind is that mothers there had almost as much leisure time as fathers and almost as much what they call pure leisure time or time to themselves. Whereas in the United States and places like Australia and the UK, most of the time, mothers' leisure is spent with their kids, and time with other adults and time for themselves. It's really dropped off to being almost zero in the last couple decades. So I really wanted to understand what's going on in Denmark that would enable people to have so much leisure time. And I found it's really very interesting. And I can tell you more, but I'm afraid that I'm running out of time. And then the last part of that book, of that chapter, looks at play and why it's important, the science and history of play. And I think what was fascinating about that is there was a philosopher who said that we are one of the only species that not only plays as juveniles, but plays as adults. And it's not like as adults we're going to have, dress up and tea parties, but having a playful attitude, telling stories, sharing jokes, spending time, with friends. There's lots of different forms that play takes as an adult. And that what play does, it sculpts our brains to be creative, flexible, and adaptive. And in doing so, then it creates creative, flexible, and adaptive societies. That it really is critical. And so this philosopher said we should not be called Homo sapiens, the rational human, but Homo ludens, the playing human.
So, Brigid, thank you for taking us through your book. And this next question I feel like is going to ask you to take it, all of what you just discussed, and kind of put it even further in a nutshell. And that's, if the reader could only take away one concept, principle, or action item out of your entire book, everything you just discussed with us, what would you want that to be?
Pause. You have to take a moment to pause. You have to disrupt this cycle of busyness. There's so much cultural pressure out there to overwork, to overdo, to be the ideal worker, to be the ideal parent. There's this pressure that leisure is silly and stupid and not important, and that you always have to be productive. And truly, to be truly productive, to be truly efficient and true to yourself, to be productive in the things that matter most to you, you have to take a moment and pause. And try to do it regularly. And it doesn't have to be going off to a cave and meditating for 5 months. In my book and in the epilogue, I talk about really fascinating research at Harvard. And they found that if you take a break for as little as 27 minutes a day, your brain actually expands, structurally expands. And so sometimes it can be just to start, you hang up the phone, you take a pause, you take a breath, you make sure that you kind of check in with yourself. What's important to you? What do you want to be spending your time on? What does your life mean?
So there's several quote-worthy things that you just said, but that's actually the next question as well. Do you have a favorite quote from your book? Or maybe if you don't, has there been something that you wrote that has really resonated with your audience?
It's funny. It depends on which part of the book that you're reading. That's funny. I wasn't ready for that one. Let me see. Well, in the beginning of every chapter, I have other people's quotes, I guess, that I think are really right on. And I suppose, if it would be okay to quote somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, there's a couple that I use that I think are really important, and that is, that time is. Let's see, let me find it. Where's in the appendix? I have it. Let me just turn to it if you don't mind. Carl Sandburg said, "Time is the coin of your life. You spend it. Do not allow others to spend it for you." And I think that goes back to that the importance of taking that time to pause, to figure out what's important to you, and am I doing something because it's in line with my own values and what's important, or am I doing it because I think I should because everybody else is? So that's where that time to pause and disrupt that kind of automatic busyness, that automatic diving into the next thing on the to-do list comes. Really take the time, and it's sort of a lifetime journey. Make it a practice to regularly check in with yourself to figure out, are you doing what's in line with what's most important to you?
That's an extremely powerful quote, and we will make sure to put that with our show notes that the listener can go back and look at that. And Brigid, it wouldn't be a book podcast if I didn't ask you for a book recommendation. So if there was only one book you could recommend to our listeners, based on the way it's impacted your life, based on the way it's created a paradigm shift or a lifestyle shift, what book would you recommend?
Oh man, does it have to be just one? There's so many great books out there, and I'll turn around and you should see my bookshelf. It's just crammed with great books, and I've got 70 pages of endnotes for all of you people out there. I really wanted this to be a very well reported piece.
You can mention more than one.
Okay, good. Geez, what do I love? There are just so many great books in this vein. I mean, I love anything Dan Pink writes. I think that he's brilliant, and I love how he helps us kind of think in a new way. A whole new mind and drive come to mind. I thought they were really powerful. I love Megan McArdle, The Upside of Down, about why failing is important. I think sometimes we forget. We think we have to be perfect, and we forget, particularly as in this kind of era where things are unclear and things are shifting. It's really important to try and then fail. And for that, Carol Dweck's book about having a growth mindset is also a very powerful book that I could go on and on. And I would love to, because there's so many brilliant people out there, and their work has inspired me and helped me change my own life.
So, Brigid, thank you for those book recommendations. And before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to not only get more information on you, but also on your book, Overwhelmed?
Sure. I do have a website, BrigidSchulte.com, and it's BrigidSchulte. It's a strange spelling, so it might be hard to find. But I've got resources on my website. I really wanted that to be a place where people could go and really engage with the material and learn more. And I do have a newsletter that goes out that they can sign up for. It's occasional and irreverent, so it's I only send it out when I think that there's something important to say or to share. They can follow me on Twitter. I'm fairly active on Twitter. I do have a Facebook page. Please go and like it. I try to post fairly often, and I love engaging with readers there. And there's lots of great stories and tips that people share back and forth, because it's really all about finding a way to live the good life. And then I do have a page you can go to on the Washington Post. I'm a little hard to find there, but if you search for Brigid Schulte in Washington Post, you'll find my page there with a lot of all of the stories that I've written, the stories, blog posts, and I do write about what I call the good life and along these themes for the Washington Post as well.
So, Brigid, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your book with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening in today. If you'd like more information on Brigid or her book, Overwhelmed, Check out the show notes at the elpodcast.com.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to the elpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's the elpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.